Welcome back to Stormi Talks True Crime on my Girls Rock Productions channel, where I tell some of the most heinous true crime stories in all of history. In this week's video, I'll be telling the tragic story of Chris Coleman. Remember to like and subscribe to this channel for more of my content. Now, parts of the story are too graphic for YouTube, so you can check out my Patreon for Stormi Talks True Crime, The Aftermath, where you will have access to the full story as well as my personal analysis as a true crime enthusiast. I will have a link to my Patreon in the description box below, as well as the comments. I do want to give a disclaimer that the story does involve the unaliving of children, so if that is something that you are uncomfortable with, just join us for next week's story. Chris Coleman was born March 20th, 1977 to Ron and Connie Coleman, making him another person lying on the water-fire cusp, being a Pisces-Aries cusp on the Pisces side. He grew up in an evangelical Christian family in a small suburb about an hour's drive south of St. Louis, Missouri. His parents were co-pastors at the Grace Evangelical Church. After high school, Chris would join the Marines and trained in K-9 unit as a dog handler. He would also work with security during his time, and was even on the guard detail for the U.S. President. Sherry Wise was born on July 3, 1977 in Cicero, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, making her a Cancer. She grew up a huge baseball fan and loved the White Sox. When she was 10, her family would move to Tampa Bay, Florida, where she would play varsity softball and became a cheerleader. She and her best friend, Tara Lentz, would graduate together in 1995, and she would work as a waitress before joining the Air Force and worked as a military police officer. The two would meet in Quantico, Virginia, while they were both attending a dog training seminar and immediately hit it off. The couple started dating, and before long, Sherry would become unexpectedly pregnant. Coming from a very religious background, Chris decided to do the right thing and marry her. In their early 20s, Chris and Sherry married in Chicago outside his parents' church. When Chris called to tell his parents the good news, they were clearly not happy. He had just introduced Sherry to them as a friend from Chicago, and she wasn't a born-again Christian like they were, which didn't really fit into their lifestyle. A few months later, on April 30th, 1998, their first son, Garrett Coleman, was born, making him a Taurus. Just under 3 years later, on January 25th, 2000, their second son, Gavin, was born, making him a Capricorn Aquarius cusp on the Aquarius side. When Chris was a young boy, his parents became friends with a woman named Joyce Meyer. Joyce was also an evangelical preacher who had worked her way up to become one of the richest money-making preachers in the world. Joyce preached what is known as prosperity theology, which is a belief that insists that financial wealth is the will of God, and that the more money you make, the more money you give to the church, the more favorably God will look upon you and bring financial riches back to you. For obvious reasons, this type of belief comes with its fair share of critics, especially when it comes from someone who flaunts their wealth as flamboyantly as Joyce Meyer. To this day, Joyce is still one of the more successful evangelical televangelists in the world. It was estimated that her businesses were grossing over $100 million per year while she traveled around the world with her $10 million personal jet, preaching to huge crowds. Her headquarters in Missouri has a $23,000 antique marble toilet. Yes, you heard that right, a $23,000 toilet. Chris's father met Joyce at a prayer conference where she told him that she needed someone to train a guard dog for her. Ron had the perfect candidate, and it reintroduced her to his son. Chris trained Joyce's dog and landed himself a job on her security detail, and he was soon promoted to Chief of Security, a position that paid over $100,000 a year. Now, the job application did come with a spiritual requirement. This was that he had to be of the same faith and that he could not divorce, among other requirements. Chris was well versed in the evangelical movement and had been speaking in tongues since 1996. Sherry had also joined the evangelical movement and eventually donated her time to Joyce's ministries in the World Outreach Program, where she worked as an EMT. Chris's pay raise made it to where the family could move to the affluent suburb development known as Columbia Lake. This was a close-knit neighborhood where Sherry and the kids made many friends. While they seemed like the perfect couple to the outside world, it was a very different story behind closed doors. The marriage started to crumble in early 2008. Sherry did have 3 friends that didn't know each other. If they had, this story might have ended differently. The first friend, Sherry's neighbor Vanessa, first started noticing bruises on her upper legs. Vanessa and her husband also started to notice that Sherry was always wearing pants and long sleeves. Unfortunately, they decided not to report their thoughts of abuse. The second friend, Megan, said that Sherry would confide in her that Chris was beating her. Megan and her husband begged Sherry to move in with them, but she refused to leave Chris. Instead, she insisted that it wouldn't happen again. The third friend was her best friend from high school, Tara Lentz. At this point in time, Tara was recently divorced and still living in Tampa Bay, working as a cocktail waitress and jumping around from boyfriend to boyfriend. In October 2008, Sherry called Tara to tell her that Joyce Meyer was having a conference in Tampa and that Tara should attend. By then, Sherry had become quite religious and thought not only that Tara's lifestyle was reckless, but also that Joyce's preaching could help her. Chris and Tara had already met when Tara visited them in Quantico, back before he was married to Sherry. Sherry suggested she meet with Chris since he would be flying in a few days before the conference to make security preparations. Sherry didn't know it at the time, but this suggestion would be a mistake. Chris and Tara had dinner and drinks and wasted no time starting up an affair. By the time the conference was over, Chris asked Joyce if he could spend a few more days in Tampa. Immediately after his return from Florida, Chris got on his laptop and created a document titled All About Tara. He typed out her birthday, her dog's birthday, her height, weight, clothing sizes, favorite perfume, favorite sports teams, and favorite ice cream flavors. He even wrote down what their daughter's name would be, Zoe Lynn Coleman. The heading of the document was November 5th, 2008, the day that Tara changed my life. Almost immediately after he arrived home, he and Joyce started receiving threatening emails. For the actual emails, check out Stormi Talks True Crime, The Aftermath. These emails would come from the email account destroychris@gmail.com with the name fchris. Some of the subject lines of these emails were F. Chris's family, they are dead. Go to hell. Houston death? Houston death. Chris would immediately report these threats to the local police. The police force in Columbia was small, but they did assign extra patrols to drive by the Coleman's house daily to be safe. Meanwhile, these things at the Coleman's household were getting worse. Chris had started to direct more hostility towards Sherry. On November 25th, just before Thanksgiving, Chris cornered Sherry in the kitchen and said he wanted a divorce. He told her that she and the boys were getting in the way of his career. Sherry didn't want a divorce. She said she still loved him and asked her friends to pray for her in her marriage. In mid-December, Chris had to take another business trip to Florida and met up with Tara once again in an Orlando hotel. This time they would exchange promise rings. On December 21st, Sherry called Chris and begged him to come home for the holidays, but he refused. Instead, he told Sherry that she and the kids were keeping him from realizing God's destiny. He did eventually go back home on December 24th. The following week, on January 2nd, Chris called the local police. He had received another letter. This time, the letter was typed on plain paper and hand-delivered to their mailbox on his herd. Sherry was terrified. In this letter, the words publicly and opportunities were misspelled. The city of Columbia was just a small town with a very small police force and only 2 detectives. One of the detectives, Justin Barlow, just so happened to live across the street from the Colemans and was assigned to the case. Detective Barlow would set up a camera from his own house facing the Coleman's house and mailbox, and assigned extra patrols to the neighborhood. That April, Chris had another trip with Joyce Meyer Ministries, this time to Maui, Hawaii. And of course, he invited Tara. They would make sure that none of Chris's co-workers spotted them together. He knew that he would lose his job if caught due to the spiritual criteria clause. They also made more plans for the relationship during this trip, including Chris giving Tara a deadline for when he would hand Sherry the divorce papers, May 4th. When Chris returned from Maui and checked the mailbox on April 27th, he found another threatening letter. Chris said that his security camera caught someone putting the letter into the mailbox, but he didn't have a way of recording it. Strangely, Detective Barlow's camera across the street saw no activity around the mailbox. When May 4th rolled around, Chris called Tara to tell her that his attorney said there were some typos in the divorce papers, so he couldn't serve them to Sherry that day. He would be serving them to her the next day, though. But she would soon find out there was no attorney or divorce papers. That evening, Barlow's camera caught Chris, Garrett, and Gavin playing baseball in front of the yard just before sunset. The boys asked their father if they could stay the night at neighbor Brandon's house to celebrate his birthday, but Chris refused, telling them it wasn't a good night. Brandon's mother thought it was weird because the boys had been staying the night with him for the last several years on that specific night. Just 12 hours later, on the morning of May 5th, 2009, Detective Barlow got an early morning phone call he would never forget. Chris called at 6:43 a.m. while driving home from St. Louis County Gym and asked Detective Barlow to check on his house. He had been trying to contact Sherry by phone, but she wasn't answering. He said Sherry and the kids should have been up by then, and he was worried. Detective Barlow called for more backup, crossed the street, and knocked on the door. No answer. When his backup arrived a few minutes later, they walked around the house. This is when they found the window open and the screen sitting next to the house. The officers called for more backup and crawled through the open window with guns drawn. As they climbed up the stairs, the smell of spray paint immediately hit them. What they found as they entered the house was horrific. The scene looked like something from the Manson murders. The walls were spray painted with rants similar to the letters and emails. As they walked up the stairs to the second floor, Officer Donjon found 31-year-old Sherry naked on her bed in the master bedroom with a black eye and ligature marks around her neck. He put his hand under her shoulder to lift her and check to see if she was breathing, but rigor mortis had already set in and she was stiff. Officer Patton enters Gavin's room, where he found the 9-year-old face down in his Spider-Man pajamas. His skin was purplish and cold to the touch. He was also stiff. FU was spray painted on the sheets covering him. Detective Barlow went into 11-year-old Garrett's room. He, too, was cold and stiff. His lips were blue, his skin was gray, and he had ligature marks around his neck. Even though Chris was only 7 minutes away, it would take him almost 20 minutes to arrive at the scene. Several squad cars were parked on the street and police tape surrounded the house. When Chris finally did arrive, Detective Barlow told him that his family was dead. He didn't attempt to go upstairs, and more importantly, he didn't ask how they died. He just sat on the driveway and sobbed. He then took out his BlackBerry to call his work and his father. When investigators brought Chris in for his statement, things didn't seem to add up. Chris claimed that he left the house that morning to go to the gym at 5:43 a.m. and claimed his wife and family were alive and well when he left. However, rigor mortis had already set in by the time the bodies were discovered just over an hour later. A forensic pathologist took liver temperatures on the bodies and determined all three died between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. During the interrogation, and despite the room being warm, Chris claimed to be very cold and asked for a blanket, and then only covered his arms. That's when the detectives noticed the scratches on his arms. Investigators asked Chris about his relationship with Sherry. He admitted to having some communication problems, but nothing that bad. They asked if anything was going on in the relationship that Sherry wouldn't have approved of. And his response was that he did text Tara a ton. but he insisted that he wasn't having an affair, that Tara was just someone to talk to. What Chris didn't know at the time was that the investigators already knew about Tara. They had already spoke to the St. Petersburg, Florida police, who were interrogating Tara at the same time, and she was giving a very different story of their relationship. A major case squad was assigned to the case with 25 investigators. When investigators went through his cell phone and computers, the evidence just started piling up. The most incriminating evidence that they would find is proof that the emails and letters came from Christopher's computer. If you would like to hear more on the evidence that was found, check out my Patreon. The link will be in the description box and comments below. Now, of course, most of the evidence found was just circumstantial, but there was a lot of it. But what would be the motive? Why kill his entire family when he could just get the divorce? Well, remember that spiritual clause in his contract? That clause made it to where an affair or a divorce would cost him his high-paying job. Chris Coleman was arrested on May 19th, 2 weeks after the murders. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and pleaded not guilty. Despite his high-paying $100,000 per year job, they determined that Chris was indigent or poor, and he was assigned 2 experienced death penalty defense attorneys. Many precautions were taken due to the media attention around the case. The trial would begin April 25th, 2011, almost 2 years after the murders. For more about what went on during the trial, check out my Patreon. Jurors began deliberations on May 4th, 2011, and returned with a guilty verdict on all 3 counts. As a result, Chris Coleman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, Chris Coleman insists he is innocent. His parents still stand by him, and he has unsuccessfully tried to appeal his conviction. Prosecutors still believe Tara had no knowledge of Chris's plans. Well, that concludes this week's episode of Stormi Talks True Crime. Feel free to leave comments on this story below or suggestions of other stories you may like to see. Don't forget to check out some of my other playlists while you are here. Stormi Teaches Music. I release a cover video on Mondays at 6 p.m. Eastern and a video of me teaching the song covered on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. You can catch the live stream of the lesson on Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on my Patreon. On Stormi Does Arts playlist, I have some of the partial videos of my live stream you can get on my Patreon for the gold tier or higher. These streams are daily at 11 a.m. Eastern. There is a link to my Patreon in the description box below. Finally, check out my Stormi Tells Ghost Stories, where I talk about haunted cities around the world. These videos are posted Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. For anyone who wants to make a one-time donation to the channel to help keep it running while I'm trying to build my audience, there is a QR code to my Venmo and CashApp on the screen. There is also a link to both in the description box and comments below. Be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons on your way out, and I will see you next Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. Till then, stay safe and have a great week.